The first rule of the ER at Northwood General was that chaos had a rhythm. It was a frantic, discordant symphony of beeping monitors, the squeal of gurney wheels on linoleum, the strained murmur of hushed conversations, and, underneath it all, the metronome of a human heart fighting to keep its beat. Elara Ellie Vance moved through the cacophony not as a conductor, but as a seasoned musician who knew her part by heart. Tonight, her part was a frantic solo. A 6-year-old with a suspected burst appendix was screaming for his mom in Bay 2. A cardiac arrest had just been called in Bay 4, the crash cart rattling its way there like an angel of death. And in the middle of it all, Ellie was trying to start an IV on a dehydrated, elderly woman whose veins were as thin and fragile as dried-up riverbeds. "Just one more try, sweetie," Ellie murmured, her voice a low, calm counterpoint to the surrounding panic. She ignored the blinking light on the call board that showed 3 other patients waiting, ignored the pungent, metallic smell of blood from the trauma bay, and focused on the single, vital task in front of her. The needle slid in. A flash of dark red blood confirmed she was in. She secured the line with practiced efficiency, a small, grim victory in a war of attrition she was slowly losing. "Nurse!" A sharp, imperious voice cut through the air. Ellie didn't look up. "In a minute. I need attention now. I'm bleeding." She finished taping down the line and gave the elderly woman's hand a reassuring squeeze before turning. Standing by the triage desk was a man who was profoundly out of place. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke suit that was likely worth more than her monthly salary, though its perfection was marred by a long, dark gash in the sleeve and a crimson stain that was steadily growing. His hair was impeccably styled, his jaw was set in a line of profound annoyance, and his eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, were scanning the chaos with the detached appraisal of a landlord inspecting a property for code violations. "The wait time is currently 4 hours for non-critical injuries," she said, her tone flat as she stripped off her gloves. "There's a clinic on 7th Street that might be faster." The man's eyebrow arched. "I'm not going to a clinic. I own the building." Ellie blinked. She looked from his expensive shoes to his patrician face and back again. A flicker of recognition sparked. She'd seen his picture in the hospital's monthly newsletter, the one that celebrated new budget cuts and profit margins. Julian Croft, the new CEO, the 30-something wonderkind who'd inherited the hospital network from his father and ran it with the ruthless efficiency of a tech startup. "Well, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice betraying none of her surprise. "Welcome to the factory floor. As you can see, we're a little backed up. If you're stable, you'll have to wait." He gestured impatiently at his arm. "This is not stable." Ellie grabbed a pair of sterile gloves and scissors, her movements sharp. "Let me be the judge of that." She led him to the only available space, a gurney in the hallway, separated from the main flow by a thin, stained curtain. As she cut away the ruined fabric of his sleeve, she saw the wound. It was deep, a clean slice that gaped open, but it had missed the artery. It was messy, but he wasn't going to die. Not today, not here. "You'll live," she announced, her voice dry. "You'll need stitches, though, and a tetanus shot." "When was your last one?" "I have no idea," he said, his tone clipped. He was watching her, his analytical gaze taking in the faint shadows under her eyes, the determined set of her mouth. "Is this how your ER is always run?" "It's pandemonium." "This is a slow Tuesday," Ellie shot back, swabbing the wound with antiseptic. He flinched, but didn't make a sound. "This is what happens when you cut the nursing budget by 15% and close down the West Wing's overflow unit to convert it into a private, for-profit elective surgery center. The numbers on your spreadsheets have names and faces down here." A flicker of something surprise? Annoyance? Crossed his face. He was clearly not used to being challenged, especially not by an ER nurse with a bloodstain on her scrubs. Those decisions were made to ensure the long-term financial viability of the hospital. "The long-term viability of a patient is usually our primary concern," she retorted, preparing a suture kit. "Hold still." Her fingers were nimble and sure as she administered the local anesthetic. For the first time since he'd arrived, the ER's chaotic symphony seemed to fade into the background. There was only the small, focused pool of light from the overhead lamp, the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic, and the surprisingly steady rhythm of his breathing. He watched her hands as she worked, the way she moved with an economy and grace born of endless repetition. She was an artist at work, her needle dancing through his skin, pulling the separated edges together into a neat, clean line. She wasn't angry, he realized. She was just tired. but underneath the exhaustion was a core of steel. He'd met with dozens of department heads, doctors, and administrators. They all spoke his language, the language of metrics, budgets, and outcomes. This woman, with her blunt words and steady hands, spoke a different language entirely. It was the language of the place itself, the one he'd been reading about in reports but had never truly heard. "Why are you a nurse?" he asked suddenly, the question surprising even himself. Ellie didn't pause in her work. "My little brother had cystic fibrosis. I spent most of my childhood in hospitals. Some nurses treated him like a diagnosis. A few treated him like a person. I decided I wanted to be one of the few." The simple, unadorned honesty of her answer silenced him. It was a reason so pure, so disconnected from profit or ambition, that it felt alien in his world. He looked around the hallway, at the faces of the tired people waiting on hard plastic chairs, at the nurses rushing from one crisis to the next, and for the first time, he felt a sliver of doubt about the clean, sterile numbers he governed. She tied off the last stitch, her work a perfect, precise seam. "All done," she said, applying a sterile dressing. "Try not to sign any multi-million-dollar deals with that arm for a day or two. A resident will be by with your tetanus shot and discharge papers, eventually." She started to pull the curtain back, her part in his story seemingly over. "Wait," Julian said. He looked down at his arm, at the neat row of black thread holding him together. Then he looked at her. "What's your name?" "Vance," she said. "Nurse Vance." "Thank you, Nurse Vance," he said, and the words were sincere, stripped of his usual corporate armor. Ellie just gave a curt nod and disappeared back into the storm, leaving Julian Croft sitting on a gurney in the hallway of his own hospital, feeling like a stranger in his own home. He had come in with a simple cut, but he had a feeling the woman who had just stitched him up had opened a much deeper wound. The ER was a brush fire, chaotic and immediate. The medical surgical floor, where Ellie started her next rotation, was a slow, creeping rot. Here, the consequences of Julian Croft's budget cuts weren't measured in the frantic seconds of a cardiac arrest, but in the agonizingly slow decline of patients who should have been getting better. The problems were quieter, more insidious, and infinitely more frustrating. It started with the IV pumps. They were a new model, purchased in bulk from a company no one had ever heard of. "They were cheaper, Doctor," Alistair Finch had announced in a hospital-wide memo, and represented a significant step towards fiscal responsibility. To the nurses, they represented a significant step towards malpractice. They malfunctioned constantly, either failing to deliver medication or, worse, delivering it all at once in a potentially fatal bolus. Every shift began with a frantic scramble for the few remaining older, reliable pumps. Ellie's first run-in with the floor's gatekeeper happened on day 2. She found a pump silently flashing an error code on a patient's line, the life-sustaining antibiotic drip having stopped hours ago. She replaced the machine and meticulously filled out an incident report. She handed it to the head nurse, Brenda Hoskins, a woman whose sour expression seemed permanently etched onto her face. Brenda, a stout woman in her 50s with a tight perm and an even tighter grip on her perceived authority, glanced at the report before letting it drop into the shredder bin beside her desk. "We don't file reports for user error, Vance," Brenda said without looking up from her scheduling chart. "It wasn't user error," Ellie insisted, her voice even. "The machine's pump mechanism failed. It's the 3rd time this week I've seen it on this model. They're dangerous." Brenda finally looked up, her eyes small and hard. "Dr. Finch personally approved the acquisition of this new equipment. Are you suggesting our chief of staff, a celebrated physician and administrator, doesn't know what he's doing?" The question was a trap, coated in venomous sweetness. "I'm suggesting the equipment is faulty," Ellie said, refusing to be intimidated. "What I hear," Brenda said, leaning forward and lowering her voice, "is a temporary ER nurse trying to make waves on my floor. I'd advise you to keep your head down, do your job, and chart accurately. Am I clear?" The message was unmistakable. Shut up and color. The gaslighting was so blatant it left a bitter taste in Ellie's mouth. This wasn't about patient safety. It was about protecting the chain of command. Her next encounter was with the architect of the policy himself, Dr. Alistair Finch. He was handsome in a severe, silver-haired way and carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never been told he was wrong. He conducted rounds like a king surveying his domain, trailed by a retinue of terrified residents. Ellie was in a room with a patient, a diabetic woman struggling with a nasty foot infection, when Finch's entourage swept in. He barely glanced at the patient, his eyes fixed on the chart. "The protocol for this level of infection is a course of Vancotrim," he announced. Ellie cleared her throat. "Doctor, her kidney function is already compromised. Vancotrim is notoriously nephrotoxic. A course of Zeftrin would be safer, even if it's more expensive." Finch slowly turned to face her, a condescending smile playing on his lips. The residents behind him froze. "Nurse? Vance, is it? You were in the ER last week, I believe." His tone implied it was a lesser posting, a place for tradesmen, not thinkers. "We are operating under the hospital's new formulary guidelines. Vancotrim is the first-line, cost-effective treatment. We do not deviate unless absolutely necessary. With all due respect, sir, protecting a patient's remaining kidney function feels absolutely necessary." Finch's smile vanished. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hum that only Ellie could hear. "Your job is to administer the medications I prescribe. It is not to question them. Leave the medicine to the doctors and the budgets to the adults. Perhaps if you spent more time hanging drips and less time playing doctor, we wouldn't have so many reports of user error coming from this floor." He tapped the chart for emphasis and swept out of the room, leaving Ellie standing in a cloud of humiliation and rage. The daily grind was a series of 1,000 cuts. It was watching patients lie in soiled linens because there weren't enough aides to do rounds. It was reusing single-use blood pressure cuffs because Brenda kept the new ones locked in her office. It was diluting cleaning solutions to make them last longer. It was the haunted, exhausted looks on her colleagues' faces, good nurses who were being forced to compromise their ethics just to get through a shift. They saw the problems, but Brenda and Finch had cultivated a culture of fear so potent that no one dared to speak up. A week later, Julian Croft appeared on the floor. He was dressed in casual slacks and a button-down shirt, no suit, no tie. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man searching for something. He claimed it was a surprise walkthrough, but his eyes scanned the nurse's station until they landed on Ellie. Brenda immediately materialized at his side, her face stretched into a sycophantic smile. "Mr. Croft, what an honor! If you'd told us you were coming, we would have prepared." "I'll bet you would have," Ellie thought, picturing them hiding the faulty pumps and wheeling in extra staff from other floors. Julian's smile was polite but cool. "I wanted to see the day-to-day operations, Brenda." Unfiltered. His gaze flickered to Ellie. "Nurse Vance, good to see you. How's the arm?" He flexed his hand, showing a faint, pink scar. "It's healing fine, Mr. Croft," Ellie said, her tone professional. "I was hoping to get a nurse's perspective on staff morale," Julian said, directing the question to Ellie but keeping his eyes on Brenda, who was now glaring daggers. "My reports indicate that, despite the new efficiency measures, morale is at an all-time high." Ellie chose her words carefully, a delicate dance on a minefield. "The reports might not be accounting for all the variables, sir." "What variables would those be?" he pressed, his curiosity genuine. She looked him straight in the eye. "The ones that don't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. The data doesn't always show the whole picture." Before he could ask more, Brenda interjected, laughing a shrill, artificial laugh. "Oh, our Ellie! Always so dramatic!" "She's just still getting used to the pace on a proper floor after all that excitement in the ER. Now, Mr. Croft, let me show you the new charting software we've implemented." Brenda steered him away, but Julian glanced back over his shoulder at Ellie, a thoughtful, troubled expression on his face. The seed had been planted. Ellie watched them go, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. This place was a ticking time bomb, and Dr. Finch had just lit the fuse. All she could do now was wait for the explosion. The explosion came in the form of a quiet, gentle man named Arthur Gable. He was 82 years old, a retired librarian with a mischievous twinkle in his eye, and a seemingly endless supply of stories about his late wife Eleanor. He had been admitted with a moderate case of pneumonia, and under normal circumstances, he would have been home in a week, complaining about the hospital food. But these were not normal circumstances. This was Northwood General. Ellie developed a soft spot for Mr. Gable immediately. He reminded her of her grandfather. She made sure his water pitcher was always full, took the time to listen to his stories about Eleanor, and even snuck him a real blueberry muffin from the downstairs cafe one morning. He was recovering well, his breathing improving each day. He was a bright spot in the oppressive gloom of the floor. The problem started with his central line, a catheter inserted into a large vein to deliver antibiotics. The hospital, under Finch's Efficiency Savings Initiative, had switched vendors. The new kits were flimsy, the sterile dressings barely adhesive. Ellie had complained to Brenda twice that the dressings were peeling, leaving the insertion site vulnerable to infection. Both times, Brenda had told her to make do and use extra tape. On a Tuesday night, the unit was short-staffed again. The ward was full, and there were only 3 nurses for 30 patients. The call bells were a constant, unanswered chorus. Ellie was running from room to room, prioritizing the most critical needs: a patient with falling oxygen levels, another with post-operative bleeding. She didn't get to Mr. Gable's room for a full check for nearly 2 hours. When she did, she knew something was terribly wrong. He was shivering violently, his skin clammy and pale. His blood pressure was dangerously low. The area around his central line was red and inflamed. Sepsis. A raging, full-blown infection was poisoning his blood. It was a direct result of contamination from the faulty dressing. It was a complication that was completely, utterly preventable. Ellie slammed the code blue button. The room flooded with people, the quiet of the night shattered by the frantic urgency of a medical emergency. They worked on him for what felt like an eternity, but the infection had too much of a head start. His old, frail body couldn't fight it. Arthur Gable died at 3:17 a.m. The aftermath was a hollow, echoing silence. Ellie stood outside the room, his last words to her, a joke about a book he wanted to read, playing over and over in her mind. Grief washed over her, a cold, heavy tide. But underneath it, something else was kindling, a white, hot, diamond, hard fury. Mr. Gable hadn't died from pneumonia. He had been killed. Killed by a cheap dressing, by a spreadsheet, by a system that had valued a few saved dollars over his life. The next morning, running on nothing but caffeine and rage, Ellie bypassed Brenda. She bypassed the entire chain of command. She walked straight to Dr. Finch's spacious office on the top floor. She didn't knock. He was on the phone, laughing about a golf game, when she stormed in and slammed a copy of Mr. Gable's chart on his polished mahogany desk. "Arthur Gable is dead," she said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "He died from sepsis that originated from a contaminated central line, one of the new, cheap lines you insisted we use." Finch ended his call, his charming demeanor evaporating like mist. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at her not with alarm or concern, but with the mild annoyance of a man swatting away a fly. "Mr. Gable was an elderly man with multiple comorbidities," he said, his voice a condescending purr. "Complications, unfortunately, do happen. It's a sad reality of medicine. This wasn't a complication. It was a direct result of your budget cuts. Those dressings don't adhere properly. The catheters are subpar. I have filed 6 reports on them. We are understaffed to the point that we can't provide adequate monitoring. You know this is happening." To her shock, he didn't deny it. He simply smiled, a chilling, reptilian smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What I know, Nurse Vance, is that you are becoming a liability. You're emotional, hysterical even. It's clouding your judgment." He stood up and walked around the desk, invading her personal space. He was taller than her, and he used his height to loom, to intimidate. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You are a temporary, disposable employee. I have the complete confidence of the board and the CEO. If you breathe one more word of these baseless, slanderous accusations to anyone, another nurse, a patient's family, anyone, I will not just fire you. I will personally see to it that your license is reviewed for professional misconduct. I will bury you under so much litigation that you will be paying legal fees for the rest of your life. I will ensure you are blacklisted from every reputable hospital in this state. No one will believe an overwrought nurse over their decorated chief of staff. Do you understand me?" The threat was so naked, so absolute, it stole the air from her lungs. This wasn't a man making a mistake. This was a man actively covering up a crime. He was a monster wearing a white coat. Ellie stood her ground, looking him straight in his cold, dead eyes. She didn't say a word. She just turned and walked out of his office, the door clicking shut behind her. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in her chest, but the fury had crystallized into something new. It was no longer a hot, blinding rage. It was a cold, sharp, and focused resolve. He thought he had silenced her. He was wrong. He had just declared war. She couldn't fix the system from the inside. Fine. She would burn it to the ground from the outside. That night, Ellie didn't sleep. She sat at her small kitchen table, the glow of her laptop illuminating her determined face. She compiled everything. Copies of the incident reports Brenda had lost, A log of every equipment malfunction she had witnessed. Dates, times, patient initials. She took out her phone and scrolled through the photos she'd secretly taken of frayed wiring on monitors, of supply closets stocked with expired bandages. This wasn't just about Mr. Gable anymore. It was for every patient whose life was being gambled with. The game was over. It was time to blow the whistle. The hospital's retaliation was swift and brutal. The day after her confrontation with Finch, Ellie was called into Brenda's office. A stony-faced woman from Human Resources was also present. Ellie was handed a letter. Effective immediately, she was placed on indefinite administrative leave pending an investigation into repeated insubordination and creating a hostile work environment. She was to vacate the premises immediately. "You can't be serious," Ellie said, disbelief warring with a sickening sense of inevitability. "Oh, I am," Brenda said, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. "Your locker has been cleared out. Security will escort you." Two uniformed guards, men she recognized and had shared coffee with, stood waiting. They looked uncomfortable, refusing to meet her eyes as they walked her through the ward. Her colleagues watched, their faces a mixture of fear and sympathy. No one said a word. The message was for them as much as it was for her. This is what happens when you step out of line. The walk of shame out of the hospital she had worked so hard in was the most humiliating moment of her life. Sitting in her small apartment, the silence buzzing around her, Ellie felt a wave of despair. Finch had isolated her, cut her off. But as she looked at the folder of evidence on her coffee table, the despair hardened again into resolve. He had underestimated her. He thought firing her was the end. It was just the beginning. She knew she couldn't go to the board. Finch had them in his pocket. She couldn't go to the press. They'd shred her credibility with anonymous hospital sources. There was only one person who had the power to act, one person who had shown even a flicker of doubt about the hospital's perfect facade, Julian Croft. It was a wild gamble. He was the CEO. Finch was his man. But she remembered the look in his eyes when she'd told him why she became a nurse. She remembered his troubled expression on the ward. It was a long shot, but it was the only one she had. Her hospital email had been deactivated. Her access was gone. She texted a friend, another nurse she trusted, and asked for a favor. A few minutes later, her friend logged into the hospital's internal directory and sent Ellie a screenshot of Julian Croft's corporate email address. Ellie took a deep breath and began to type. She kept it short, direct, and urgent. Subject: Northwood General, urgent. Mr. Croft, my name is Alara Vance. I am the nurse who stitched your arm in the ER. I was placed on administrative leave today for trying to report critical patient safety failures on the medical surgical floor. The numbers are lying. People are dying. The cost-saving measures have created a crisis, and Dr. Finch is actively covering it up. I have proof. Meet me, please. She hit send, her heart pounding. The next few hours were agonizing. Every notification on her phone made her jump. Finally, just after midnight, a reply came from a private, encrypted email address. Tomorrow, 7 a.m., the Bluebird Cafe on Elm Street. Come alone. Relief, potent and dizzying, washed over her. He was willing to listen. The Bluebird Cafe was a small, quiet place. Julian was already there, sitting in a back booth, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. He looked tired, the confident CEO persona replaced by a guarded tension. Without preamble, Ellie laid the folder on the table between them. For 20 minutes, she talked. She told him everything. The faulty pumps, the cheap supplies, the impossible nurse-to-patient ratios. She told him about Brenda's threats, about Finch's open contempt for patient safety. And then, her voice cracking for the first time, she told him about Arthur Gable. He was a lovely man, she finished, her voice thick with emotion. He should be alive right now. Julian listened without interruption, his face growing paler with every word. He opened the folder and looked through the evidence, the reports, the photos. When he saw the copy of Mr. Gable's death certificate, he froze. Arthur Gable, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. I knew him. He was my father's college roommate, my dad's best friend. The corporate veil shattered completely. This was no longer an abstract problem. It had a face. It had a name he knew. He looked up at Ellie, his blue eyes filled with a storm of horror and fury. I believe you, he said. Meanwhile, Dr. Finch was not idle. Learning of Ellie's suspension, he anticipated her next move. He decided to neutralize her before she could become a threat. He and Brenda concocted a story. They went through pharmacy records and found a discrepancy in the narcotics log from a day Ellie was working, a discrepancy created by Brenda's own sloppy bookkeeping. It was all they needed. 2 days after her meeting with Julian, there was a loud knock on Ellie's apartment door. She opened it to find 2 uniformed police officers. "Are you Alara Vance?" one of them asked, his expression grim. "Yes? We have a report from Northwood General regarding the theft of a controlled substance. We need to ask you some questions." Ellie's blood ran cold. The interrogation took place in her own living room. The officers were professional, but their questions were pointed and accusatory. They told her she was the primary suspect in the disappearance of a vial of morphine. They implied that the stress of her job had maybe led her to seek an outlet. It was a classic, disgusting attempt to paint her as an unstable drug addict. She vehemently denied everything, but the damage was done. They were trying to build a criminal case against her, something that would make her a completely non-credible witness. The fury and helplessness were suffocating. They were going to ruin her life to protect their profits. What Finch didn't know was that Julian was moving faster. Armed with Ellie's evidence and his own personal grief, he had bypassed his usual channels and secretly hired a team of forensic accountants to conduct an immediate, deep-dive audit into Dr. Finch's single-source supply vendor. The next afternoon, Julian called an emergency meeting of the hospital's board of directors. Dr. Finch was in the middle of a presentation, showcasing slides with upward-trending profit margins and glowing efficiency statistics. "And as you can see," Finch said, smiling his predatory smile, "our efficiency and savings initiative has been an unprecedented success." "I disagree," a cold voice said from the doorway. Every head turned. Julian Croft stood there, his face set like granite. Beside him, looking terrified but resolute, was Ellie Vance. Finch's face paled. "Mr. Croft, what is the meaning of this? This is a closed meeting, and that woman is no longer an employee here. Security. Security will stand down," Julian commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "She is here at my invitation. Because it seems, Dr. Finch, that your definition of success is quite different from mine." The room crackled with tension. Board members exchanged confused, anxious glances. Finch regained his composure, his expression shifting to one of concerned condescension. "Julian, this woman is a disgruntled employee under investigation for narcotics theft. She is hardly a reliable source." "Is that what you told the police?" Ellie shot back, finding her voice. "After you killed Arthur Gable?" An uproar filled the room. Julian held up a hand for silence. "Dr. Finch, I'd like you to meet Nurse Vance. She's been trying to tell us that your efficiency has been killing our patients. And I have to say, her evidence is far more compelling than your slideshow." He motioned for Ellie to speak. With every eye in the room on her, she stepped forward. Her voice shook for a moment, then steadied, filled with the righteous anger that had been simmering for weeks. She didn't talk about metrics or margins. She told them stories. She gave them the names and faces behind Finch's numbers. She spoke of the woman with the diabetic foot infection, the man whose antibiotic drip had failed, and finally, her voice thick with sorrow, she told them every detail about Arthur Gable's last night. "You have a choice," she finished, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the board members. "You can continue to look at your spreadsheets, or you can look at the people whose lives you hold in your hands." Finch laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This is absurd. A sentimental, unsubstantiated rant from a known troublemaker. You have no proof." "Oh, but we do," Julian said softly. He pressed a button on the conference room's remote. The screen behind Finch, which had been showing profit charts, flickered to life. It was now filled with bank statements. Financial transfers, highlighted lines showing monthly payments from the medical supply company, MedEquip Solutions, directly into a private shell corporation, a corporation owned by one Dr. Alistair Finch. "The forensic accountants found it this morning," Julian said, his voice deadly calm. "Massive kickbacks. You weren't just buying cheap supplies, Alistair. You were buying your cheap supplies. You endangered hundreds of lives. You killed my father's best friend for money." The silence in the room was absolute. Dr. Alistair Finch stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The king had been checkmated. His kingdom was about to burn. The downfall was as swift as it was total. Dr. Finch didn't even try to defend himself. The fight drained out of him, replaced by the slack-jawed shock of a man watching his life crumble in real time. He was fired on the spot, escorted from the boardroom by the same security guards he had intended to use on Ellie. Brenda Hoskins, implicated by Finch in a desperate attempt to spread the blame, was unceremoniously dismissed via a phone call while she was in the middle of berating a junior nurse. The news of their termination spread through the hospital like a wildfire, communicated through hushed whispers and urgent texts. A palpable wave of relief, of vindication, washed through the wards. For the first time in years, the oppressive cloud of fear began to lift. Julian Croft addressed the entire hospital staff 2 days later in the main auditorium. He stood before them, not as a distant CEO, but as a man humbled. He publicly apologized for his ignorance, for trusting the data over the people. He admitted his focus on the bottom line had blinded him to the human cost. Then, he introduced the hospital's new path forward. Effective immediately, all contracts with MedEquip Solutions are terminated, he announced to a wave of applause. We are returning to our previous trusted suppliers. We are reopening the West Wing's overflow unit, and I am approving a 20% increase in the nursing budget to ensure safe staffing ratios on every floor. The auditorium erupted. Nurses were crying, hugging each other. It was more than just a policy change. It was a fundamental shift in philosophy, a return to the principle that a hospital's first and only priority is its patients. Then, Julian added one more thing. To ensure that the voices of our frontline staff are never silenced again, I am creating a new position. Head of Patient Advocacy. This person will report directly to me and will have the authority to investigate any and all patient safety concerns and to overhaul any system that is failing our patients. And I can think of no one more qualified for this role than Alara Vance. Ellie, standing in the wings, was stunned. A standing ovation thundered through the hall. Her colleagues, the very people she had fought for, were on their feet, their faces beaming with pride and gratitude. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Ellie traded her scrubs for a suit, her small office a hub of relentless activity. She worked tirelessly, meeting with nurses from every department, listening to their concerns, and implementing changes. The faulty 4 pumps were collected and replaced. New supply chains were established. A transparent, anonymous reporting system was created, empowering nurses to speak up without fear of retaliation. She wasn't just fixing problems anymore. She was building a new culture, one of accountability and care. The exhaustion was profound, but it was a good kind of tired, the satisfying ache of building something that mattered. About a month after the board meeting, as the initial chaos began to subside, Julian found her on the hospital's rooftop terrace. It was late evening, and the city lights twinkled below like a fallen constellation. She was leaning against the railing, looking out at the skyline, the breeze gently ruffling her hair. She'd been so immersed in her new role, they had barely spoken of anything but work. Their interactions were professional, focused, though an unspoken current of something deeper ran beneath the surface. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, following her gaze. "It's the first time in a month I feel like I can breathe," she said softly, not looking at him. "You've accomplished more in 4 weeks than most people do in a decade," he said. "You're changing this place, Ellie, from the inside out." "I had help," she said, finally turning to face him. "You had an ally," he corrected gently. "The courage was all yours." He looked down at his own arm, at the thin, silvery scar that was barely visible on his forearm. "Funny, isn't it? I came in here to get a few stitches and you ended up saving the entire hospital." "The stitch just got you to sit still long enough to listen," she said with a small smile. A comfortable silence settled between them. The professional barriers, the crisis that had thrown them together, all seemed to melt away in the cool night air. What was left was something simpler, more personal. "Ellie," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I know things have been intense, but I was wondering, now that the world is no longer on fire, would you be willing to have dinner with me?" He looked at her, his usual CEO confidence gone, replaced by a simple, hopeful vulnerability. He wasn't asking as her boss. He wasn't asking out of gratitude. He was asking as Julian. A real, genuine smile spread across her face, lighting up her tired eyes. "I'd like that," she said. "As long as we don't talk about budgets." "Deal," he said, his own smile mirroring hers. "We can talk about books. I hear you know a great one about a librarian." The shared memory of Mr. Gable hung between them, not as a source of sadness, but as a reminder of what they had fought for, of the human connection that had sparked this whole revolution. The story of Northwood General's corruption was over, but the story of Julian and Ellie, forged in a fight for what was right and sealed by a simple stitch, was just beginning.